Is this Paul Lambert?
It is.
Oh, hello. I'm writing an important paper, and I heard you were a member of this club called Skull and Bones.
I'm not. I don't have a comment on that. Our membership is private. The membership is private, and I really can't tell you whether I am or I'm not.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
Het geheime genootschap Skull and Bones werd in 1832 aan de befaamde Yale Universiteit opgericht. In hun tempel op de campus, The Tomb, worden nog ieder jaar 15 nieuwe, zorgvuldig geselecteerde leden geïnitieerd. Vandaag aflevering 2.
Well, Skull and Bones is a kind of Freemasonic association, and I guess you could call it a death cult. You can call it a satanic cult. The symbolism, of course, is the skull and crossbones, right? The death's head, or Totenkopf, I guess as the SS called it during the Second World War. It's a very sinister symbolism. It is obviously Freemasonic.
Everything about them reflects this symbolic hidden meaning. Everything they do reflects a hidden meaning.
These people that join organizations such as Bones or the Masons actually leave their family relations that they had when they were children and prolong that intimate family relationship with their brothers from the lodge. And they swear to take care of each other's interests, and they do it. And when that in the normal conduct of life is probably okay, but when one of them becomes president of the United States, it's time to ask questions. What have you sworn to do for your brothers? And what interests are you pushing that are really on their agenda, not on the agenda of the American people?
Are there any famous members or well-known members?
George Bush?
The George Bush?
Yeah. But that kind of focus is not of great interest to the members.
How do you mean?
Because we're much more interested in the personal issues than external achievement.
The best-known bonesman is ex-President George Bush, who, according to tradition, is supposed to avoid admitting he's a member, even when the question comes in the Oval Office.
Mr. President, are you a member of Skull and Bones?
Okay, you ever met Bush or?
Oh yes, he was a couple years behind me, but I have met him.
The core of Skull and Bones is 15 or 20 families. These are old line families. They came to the United States from England about the 1600s, 1700s. And you've got the Lords and the Wadsworths and the Bushes. Then you've got a newer element which arose in the 1870s, the money element, like the Harrimans, which his father was E.H. Harriman, the railroad magnate. So the core, as you go through the early 20th century, is comprised of 15 or 20 families, partially from old line American families going back to the Pilgrims, and partially from money, banking money, that came up through the late 19th century. On looking at the membership structure, one can identify a core made up of a number, as I say, 15 or 20 families, and it appears that at one time the Harrimans were the center of this core.
Een van de bekendere Bones-leden was W. Averell Harriman, jarenlang actief in hoge politieke functies onder meerdere presidenten. In zijn functie als Amerikaans ambassadeur in de Sovjet-Unie was hij aanwezig bij de conferentie van Yalta, februari 1945.
Leaders of Britain, Russia and the United States. Anthony Eden, British Foreign Minister. And Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of Great Britain. Marshal Joseph Stalin, Premier of the Soviet Union. Edward Stettinius, with Averell Harriman, United States Ambassador to Russia.
I think this is the story of Skull and Bones. Many men, I won't say all of them by any means, have this lust for power. And that, I suppose, is the basis for Skull and Bones, is a lust for power. Today, the Harriman family doesn't exist anymore. It's the Bush family, because you've got Bush, who was vice president and president, and you've got his two sons, governors of two states, Florida and Texas.
Jeb is gouverneur van Florida en George Jr. is nu nog gouverneur van Texas. Het is zeer waarschijnlijk dat hij zich kandidaat stelt voor het presidentschap. Vragen over zijn lidmaatschap van Skull and Bones weet hij behendig te ontwijken, zoals hier tijdens een persconferentie.
Does it still exist? The thing is so secret that I'm not even sure it still exists. Record that as the most unusual question I've ever been asked in my entire political.
So you can identify a core within the Bush family and also within the Lord family. But then you've got some other very interesting elements. Kerry, Senator Kerry, for example, a very influential man in the Senate, is a member of Skull and Bones. And another interesting senator was Senator Boren, B-O-R-E-N, from Oklahoma, who was chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, which is a very sensitive post. He was Skull and Bones. Now, if you take men like Lord, Bush, Boren, and Kerry, just those four men, you can control an awful lot of policy just with those four positions. You don't need very much else. You're covering intelligence, you're covering broad policy creation, and covering the political aspect, and on the floor in the Senate. Just those four, and there are many, many others.
We can certainly say that George Bush, in his political career, which reaches back into the 1950s, is a suitable metaphor to express the power of these Skull and Bones Harriman networks in modern American life.
Op zijn 18e verjaardag, Amerika was kort daarvoor in de Tweede Wereldoorlog verzeild geraakt, gaf hij zich op voor de marine. Hij vocht als piloot tegen de Japanners, vloog met een bommenwerper naar de omstreden eilanden in de Stille Oceaan, werd neergeschoten en gewond en kreeg in 1945 een hoge onderscheiding. Daarna studeerde de bankierszoon economie aan de Universiteit van Yale. Met het diploma op zak ging hij in zaken. Hij begon een bedrijfje in olieboormaterialen. In 1966 stapte hij over naar de politiek. Hij verkocht zijn bedrijf en hield daar genoeg aan over om nooit meer krap te hoeven zitten. Bush kwam in het Huis van Afgevaardigden, verloor de strijd om een senaatzetel voor Texas van Lloyd Bentsen en werd in 1970 voor Nixon ambassadeur bij de Verenigde Naties. Later zat hij ook nog ruim een jaar voor Richard Nixon in China. George Bush was voorts nog enige jaren directeur van de CIA en voorzitter van de Republikeinse Partij. Hij is dus zeer ervaren in de politiek en in het management.
You cannot arrive at any other conclusion. That behind the scenes there's some pushing and pulling and almost manipulation to advance. And advance is the word used by many, many members within Skull and Bones. They advance their interests.
What I tried to do was to look at Bush and say, is there anything good? Can you find an act of disinterested kindness? Can you find any humanitarian impulse? And I'm afraid the answer is no. What you find is dissembling. You find somebody pretending to care about charity or somebody else's suffering or misery. But these are usually tricks performed in front of the camera for electoral reasons or some other demagogic kind of strategy.
On an August day in 1988, an historic event took place. It didn't happen on Main Street or in any American town, but in Russia, where soldiers began destroying hundreds of nuclear missiles with the understanding that we'd destroy some of our own, the first disarmament treaty of its kind. And though most Americans were unaware of the significance of the moment or realized it was George Bush who led the way, someday their grandchildren will.
You have to look at him again and again and say, how did this guy make it compared to any number of other political figures that would have been perfectly plausible presidential candidates?
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
De eerste echt grote politieke rol van George Bush was zijn positie als vicepresident van Ronald Reagan. In de aanloop daarnaartoe hielp hij Reagan in uiterst turbulente tijden aan de macht te komen.
Do you really think Iranian terrorists would have taken Americans hostage if Ronald Reagan were president? Do you really think the Russians would have invaded Afghanistan if Ronald Reagan were president? Do you really think third-rate military dictators would laugh at America and burn our flag in contempt if Ronald Reagan were president? Isn't it about time we had the strong new leadership Ronald Reagan would provide as president?
8 jaar later steunde Reagan met succes zijn vicepresident in de wedloop om het nieuwe presidentschap.
America needs the strength, the vision and the true grit of George Bush.
There's a certain stability to our system, and I think experience taught me project that stability. Don't go for the grandstands. Don't over-dramatize things. The American people are entitled to know that the system works, that experienced people know how to handle moments of crisis.
Where I go into it, into the mindset or joint operation between Bush and the CIA would be in the October Surprise. And the October Surprise was a scheme involving people in the CIA and in both high-level government, both political parties. This is when Carter was president, and this is a time when there were 52 American hostages seized and imprisoned in Iran, and it was felt, as the presidential election was coming up between President Carter and challenger Reagan, that if Carter was able to get the release of these American hostages before the election, that Carter would probably be reelected. So the CIA and George Bush, at that time a private citizen, but undoubtedly an asset of the CIA, they engaged in a scheme to prevent the release of those American hostages. And there were a number of secret hearings, which I describe again in Defrauding America. And these meetings occurred in Europe and different places. And eventually, $40 million was paid to Iranians, and they were promised billions of dollars of military equipment if they don't release the hostages. Well, the hostages were not released, and the arms did flow, and this eventually led to what became known as the Iran-Contra affair.
Terrorists, be aware that when the rules of international behavior are violated, our policy will be one of swift and effective retribution.
Ronald Reagan, in the first week he was elected president 5 years ago. He was addressing the hostages who'd been held for a year in Tehran by Shiite Muslim supporters of the Ayatollah Khomeini. The Iran hostage crisis had helped make Ronald Reagan president. It finished Jimmy Carter and had provided Reagan with his strongest election campaign platform.
Uit stukken van het Huis van Afgevaardigden dat onderzoek heeft gedaan naar de October Surprise blijkt dat president Carter op de hoogte was van de onderhandelingen door Bush met de Iraniërs, maar er verder geen aandacht aan wilde besteden. Hij heeft ook nooit bewijzen willen verzamelen. Carter wilde schone handen houden.
I'll never tell a lie. I'll never make a misleading statement. I'll never betray the confidence that any of you has in me. And I will never avoid a controversial issue.
Well, the secret government, I think, would be a proper term to be applied to what I discovered about the corruption in the CIA, corruption in the Justice Department. The Justice Department and CIA corruption they work very closely together, and they have to more or less to get away with what they've done.
2.2, altimeter 3050. Visual approach is in use, landing and departing runway 4 left. Affirmative, you follow taxiway Alpha all the way down to the south end of the field. And Cherokee 393, just hold
I'm a former Air Force intelligence officer from the Vietnam War. I made a lot of connections that kept drawing me into covert operations after my discharge from the Air Force. One of those operations that I was drawn into voluntarily was the so-called Enterprise. The Enterprise was a black bag operation set up by the Reagan-Bush administration designed to assist the Contras in Nicaragua. So I was brought in by Oliver North to meet a man named Barry Seal. And Barry Seal was the person who I viewed as the chief operative, the man who had the contract, so to speak, from the CIA to set up a clandestine training base in a place called Mena, Arkansas. As you fly over the Mena airport in town, what jumps out at you is the degree of infrastructure that exists at the Mena airport in relationship to a small town of 5,000 people. You see a row of hangars, huge buildings on the west side of the north-south runway. This yellow area denotes Little Rock, Arkansas. Coming west, we'll find Hot Springs. That's Bill Clinton's hometown. And we go about 60 nautical miles further, and we'll find Mena. This is the town, and there's the airport. It wasn't until nearly 18 months into the Contra program, the training program, that I discovered and came face to face with irrefutable knowledge that I was right in the middle of a large cocaine importation ring.
I first discovered the drug trafficking by the CIA while I was an airline pilot flying in Tokyo and flying in the Middle East. But then when I was a federal investigator holding authority to make these determinations, I discovered other forms of government corruption. And more I persisted in trying to expose this, the more people that became involved. The true cover-up, it would be federal judges in the United States, Congress, other checks and balances. And then about 10 years ago, I started becoming a confidant to people who were actually flying the drugs for the CIA or the DEA, flying arms to Central America, let's say, and flying drugs back. People who helped set up the Medellin and Cali cartel who were with the CIA. Okay, here's a declaration that Gene Tatum prepared for me at my request. And it describes some of the things that he had seen. And he's describing how he reported to his handlers in the CIA and the National Security Council, including William Barr, Oliver North, George Bush. And he's talking about the drug smuggling that he witnessed as a military pilot and also as a CIA pilot. Okay, this here is one of many flight plans that Tatum gave to me. And on the back of the flight plan, in his own handwriting, he made comments about the flight. And this is the one where they met with George Bush at a location in Central America, and they met at a German restaurant where they were talking the drug-related drug smuggling activities. The value of these documents is that it gives credibility to my sources and also to what they're telling me.
These purple-colored hash marks represent what's called a military operations area, or an MOA. So that provided a blanket of security and made it a real good reason, good place to run drugs. Remote, under the radar surveillance for the most part. If you're below 4,000 feet out here, not a lot of questions asked, and they got away with it.
You have people in control of the DEA that are all part of this. And what they're doing is undermining, financially and morally undermining the United States and the American people. And of course, what they are doing also affects people in other countries.
Can you see that big knot on that mountain up there? On the other side of that was our secret training base and our covert airstrip. We had a sod runway built up there that we used as a practice drop zone to drop supplies. Pilots were taught short field landing techniques and all that, the type of runways that they would experience in Nicaragua. Nicaragua not having many paved runways, especially behind enemy lines. But at night you could see the planes coming back from Nicaragua, and the ridges over here is where you would first pick up the landing lights, and when that would happen, there'd be a flurry of activity here on the flight line as big propeller-driven military cargo planes would come lumbering into this small little sleepy town and wake up the local inhabitants. It's hard to say how much cocaine was transported into Mina during the Contra War, but one individual, Barry Seal, who ran the operation, was granted immunity by Congress to testify about what had gone wrong. And during that testimony with immunity, Barry Seal said that he had personally flown in more than 20 tons of cocaine into this airport. That's a lot of cocaine. And that's just from one individual. And there were multiple pilots. Barry was not the only pilot flying weapons to the Contras and bringing drugs back. There was no way, I accepted, that Bill Clinton didn't know about this. Barry Seal told me that the Clinton government was actually in on it, quote unquote. Bill Clinton was a necessary element. Anytime you have a third world environment, you always have a dictator at the top, and that was Bill's role. He was a young governor that would do anything for power and money. He was also, according to various sources, intelligence sources, Bill Clinton has had a relationship with the CIA going back to his days in at least as early as Oxford, perhaps even before that. But I can say this: Arkansas welcomed this operation with open arms, did absolutely nothing to interfere with it, and benefited tremendously. I had some genuine legal concerns. As I aired those concerns with Oliver North, he assured me to put those concerns aside because this was being run out of the White House by George Bush. That had been decided among the people in charge, and that would have been Ronald Reagan, CIA Director William or Bill Casey, and George Bush, that Bush had the best background to pull this off. A former director of the CIA, a man who had been in the military himself, and a person that I think history will eventually show had no moral boundaries to what he would do. I felt assured in 1983 that George Bush was a man of honor, and I felt that I could step back into the shadows, so to speak, and do what my country requested, and I did.
There are hazards involved in attempting to bring out the misconduct of the secret government. Now, in my case, for instance, I think I've been through about 30 years of the retaliation by the U.S. government. First, while I was a federal investigator, they make it very difficult for you when you report the misconduct that you encounter. Then when I started to expose the other misconduct, the CIA and what have you, Then by having control of the courts and other agencies, they put me into a position whereby they seized all of my assets. This is done in violation of law, and one time I was quite well off. I was a multi-millionaire, and I had a silly feeling that I had an obligation to report these things, and they seized everything I had, my airplanes, my businesses, my home, and if they had their way, I'd be homeless now.
Many of the players of the Mena story and the Enterprise are dead, Barry Seal in particular, but it's a risky business, and those who feel that they want to have a action-packed career for the CIA should think twice before they get deeply involved.
Finally, in 1978, I thought, well, I will publish books to make the public aware of these things, and there I had the naive thought that the public would respond, but the public doesn't respond, and so in a way the public is partly responsible for what is going on, and some people might even say the public deserves what is happening to them.
We needed cooperation by the FBI. We needed cooperation by the U.S. military, FAA, U.S. Customs, DEA. I mean, the list goes on and on of the state, federal, and local agencies who had to either assist in providing security for the enterprise, or they had to at least turn a blind eye to it.
Het Amerikaanse congres liet een onderzoek verrichten naar Mena en bevestigde in haar conclusies de drugsimporten door de CIA. Het onderzoek werd geleid door senator John Kerry, een Skull and Bones lid. Het woord Bush komt in het hele rapport niet voor.
George Bush was not out of the loop, as his famous statement was throughout these 4 or 5 years we're discussing. George Bush had his hands in every facet of this thing.
Skull and Bones is deel van een groter geheel. Van een systeem van organisaties dat achter de schermen opereert en waarin de machtigste en meest invloedrijke mensen vertegenwoordigd zijn. In de schaduw van de democratie sluit de elite de rijen.
Well, George Bush to me personifies American elitism. And this can be recognized to some extent through 3 organizations which are not controlled by Skull and Bones, but which reflect the Skull and Bones influence, again through George Bush. And one, of course, is the Bohemian Grove, which has a parallel in that it seems to admire blood and destruction, as Skull and Bones does, through its ritual built around Moloch, the god of war. Secondly, the Council on Foreign Relations, which had as a long-time chairman Winston Lord, also a Bonesman, and through the Trilateral Commission, which, although it is an international organization representing 3 regional groupings, still reflects the ideas of George Bush. It's an elitist organization. I think that's what is important. Here you've got in each of these 3 organizations, you have a group that sees itself as superior to all others within society. And I think that is the element which is carried over from Skull and Bones into these organizations, this superiority.
We're standing at Post and Taylor in San Francisco at the San Francisco Bohemian Club. This was completed in 1934 at the height of the Depression. And they spent a great deal of money building this elaborate organization here. So the motto for the club is "Weaving spiders do not enter," and it's right here on the wall. This is the owl and the plaque commemorating when the building was first built. But what this implies is that people coming here are not supposed to do business. So there's no overt business solicitation, but for years Various businesses in the community and corporations would have meetings here, official meetings, receptions, and various events. I got interested in studying elites back basically in the 1980s because I'd been a social worker for 25 years working with poor people and low-income families in the United States. And I became very concerned why this would seem to be a perpetual problem. We have over 40 million people who just cannot meet their basic needs in the United States, yet we have more wealth in this country than we've ever had. And that wealth is very concentrated in the top 1% of the population, which in fact has more wealth than 90% of the rest of us. So I wanted to understand how wealthy individuals and elites interacted, set policies, worked with the government, financed elections, and made decisions. And so that's basically how I got started and interested in elite work.
Elitism is not in the interests of the average citizen. It's not in the spirit of a free society. And it's very dangerous because there was that Lord Acton who said power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. When you've got power, it begins to corrupt you. You think you're God. You think you can make decisions for other people. And then gradually it eats away, I think, at these people until they become dictators. And then becomes the view that you have no rights because I say you have no rights.
The Bohemian Club was founded 120 years ago in San Francisco by a group of newspapermen, businessmen, and artists. Modern-day members include some of the most influential American men of the 20th century. President Bush is a member, along with former President Ronald Reagan. Also, past Secretaries of State George Shultz and Henry Kissinger.
What's unique about the San Francisco Bohemian Club is they have a private retreat, a 2,700-acre retreat up on the Russian River in Sonoma County. This is an old-growth redwood forest with trees that are 300 feet tall, 1,500 years old, that they privately own. And this grove, every year they have a summer encampment there in late July and early August that runs 2 weeks and 3 weekends. And they'll invite several hundred people to come from all over the world, other men, because it's just men only there, from all over the world.
Security at the Bohemian Grove is extremely tight. It's almost as if there were a military installation down there. Everything is kept under wraps, and in this case, under the trees. They've kicked off their retreat with a spectacular nighttime ceremony. From the air, the encampment is lit up with torches. Suddenly, the night is ablaze as robed men begin the cremation of care, a ritual that symbolizes the shedding of the burdensome responsibilities of the outside world. Such allegations about the camp have angered many who feel that leaders who adamantly embrace traditional values are not what they appear to be.
Conversation at that level is all off the record. There's no press involved, so it's like the men are getting kind of a first-hand understanding. It may not be any big trade secrets or anything, but they're getting this kind of off-the-record understanding of the way things are, or the way things should be. And I think this certainly gives them an advantage in the world, in the economic world, because they know what the directions are, what the kind of movers and shakers are thinking, and what some of the major policy considerations that are being considered, the directions that they're moving in.
Excuse me? This is a private club. You're not supposed to be here at all. Then turn the camera off.
So what happened? You want to film this guy? Did you film him already?
Is this public?
I'm sorry, where's your property line? I'm not sure. Where's the property line? I'm not sure.
Don't.
No, this is a public street, right? Right here, the crosswalk? Oh, that's fine.
Move. But you understand, move. You're not Perry Mason. You're on private property. This is private building, private sidewalk.
The private sidewalk?
Yes, sir.
No way.
I don't believe it.
Hi.
No, you're fine. There's nothing wrong with walking by this.
You're retarded or something. I think you're retarded.
Film this guy.
I think you're very sick.
Well, okay, we got the hospitality, the negative hospitality of the San Francisco Bohemian Club. There have been cases where people have written about the club and or snuck in. Dirk Matheson from People magazine snuck in. and was actually spotted by a Time Warner executive and expelled from the club, from the Grove. And he, in fact, lost his job 6 months later, although they claimed that it wasn't related to that, but it was certainly coincidental.
De volgende beelden zijn zeldzaam. Leden van de Bilderberggroep komen aan bij de jaarlijkse bijeenkomst. Ditmaal in Londen. Hier is te zien hoe journalisten ongehinderd vragen kunnen stellen aan deelnemers. Tegenwoordig is dat ondenkbaar, omdat de bijeenkomsten niet meer van tevoren worden aangekondigd en de media zorgvuldig op een afstand worden gehouden.
Adam, where are you from? BAT. BAT? London, yes. What are you doing at the conference here? I'm attending. And what do you think is going to happen at this conference? We're going to talk a lot about this and that. Are you prepared to tell me afterwards what you talk about? No. Why is that? Well, it's the nature of the conference. Why is it so secret? I know.
Well, the Skull and Bones is less important than it used to be. The heyday has passed, but its idea has continued into other organizations, including the Bilderbergers, which was founded in Holland, which is an international meeting of prominent, powerful people. They're somewhat like the Skull and Bones because they want to be secretive. Now, the media won't let them alone to some extent. They're trying to find out. But by itself, the Bilderbergers will not publish a list of where they're meeting, who they're meeting, and what they're discussing. They never publish what they discuss. So in that sense, there's a great commonality between the idea behind Skull and Bones and the idea between the Bilderbergers. The difference, of course, is that they haven't taken oaths and they don't operate in cells, I suppose. The membership changes. But the key point is that these people want to keep what they're doing to themselves, and yet at the same time they call themselves public servants and presumably owe at least openness to the people who put them there to the electorate.
This is where they met at the Badischer Hof Hotel in Baden-Baden, Germany. Normally they meet in remote areas, but this was a downtown hotel. Bilderbergs are pulling in, the guards are keeping the people away. It was at Baden-Baden, incidentally, where an obscure governor of Arkansas named Bill Clinton first attended a Bilderberg meeting. For years he had been a member of their junior varsity, the Trilateral Commission, which is somewhat more public. So we predicted at the time there'd be a fine political future for our young Governor Bill Clinton of Arkansas, who is not known to the public at large or to the nation at large at all at that time.
De Bilderberggroep werd opgericht in 1954 door prins Bernhard. Dit zijn beelden uit de tijd dat Bernhard en Beatrix nog in alle openheid de Bilderberg-bijeenkomsten bezochten.
Sinds 1954 nodigt u ieder jaar een aantal belangrijke mensen, invloedrijke mensen uit om deel te nemen aan de Bilderberg-bijeenkomsten. Wat eigenlijk wilt u daarmee bereiken?
Dat is moeilijk te zeggen. Ik wil de mensen bij elkaar brengen. En dat hebben we toen gedaan op de Bilderberg de eerste keer. En dat bleek zo'n succes. En daar werd echt hard tegen elkaar gepraat door deze mensen. En dat we gezegd hebben, dit moeten we echt meer doen.
It was not until 1975 when I came to Spotlight and they talked about Bilderberg that I even knew they existed. I said, this is not possible. I've spent 20 years poring over the AP wires, reading my own newspaper and reading everybody else's newspaper. It's not possible for this to be taking place without newspapers giving it attention. And since that time, I've done my best to give it a great deal of attention.
It's not conspiracy. It is conspiracy in a legal sense, but not in a sociological sense. These people don't sit down and plan. They know what to do instinctively. They all think the same. They're educated the same. They know the same things. They respond to the same stimulants. They're money, power, brotherhood. You don't need a telephone call. You know what to do. So, but see, until you get right into it, I suppose you do see, people smoking, a smoke-filled room and planning everything they do. I don't think they operate that way. They know what to do. I think it's a matter of influence. People, what do they say? To get along, you've got to go along. Most people want to get along, to gain power and prestige. And they know the way to do that is to listen to the guy above you. So if someone, say, in Skull and Bones calls people he knows, and these people know of the power of Skull and Bones, all it takes is a hint or a suggestion, and a policy can be implemented or killed.
You will never read about Bilderberg in the Washington Post or the New York Times and other establishment American newspapers for one reason. Katharine Graham, Mrs. Graham, chairman of the Washington Post, has attended Bilderberg meetings for years. Also, high officials of the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, the News Weeklies, and television news anchormen attend these meetings. They do so on their solemn promise to report nothing, not use that word Bilderberg in their newspapers. To me, they are journalistic prostitutes. How in the world do you attend such a momentous meeting and cover it up? Now, while Bilderberg meetings are systematically suppressed in the United States except for Spotlight, not true in Canada, where our readers there alerted the newspapers to the meeting of Bilderberg last spring in King City. Here we have a partial list of participants in this heavy story that jumps. We have photographs of Henry Kissinger, David Rockefeller, Queen Beatrix, all of whom attended the meeting.
The idea of Skull and Bones has continued, but I think it's much harder to implement because the United States is much larger, it's much more diverse. The multinational corporations, the banks, overseas interests, the foreign communities in the United States, all these are now beginning to play into policy. It would be much more difficult for a group like Skull and Bones to control today. 100 years ago, when it was homogeneous, it was a white Anglo-Saxon banking interest or corporate culture. You could control that through maybe 20 or 30 members, but not today. It's too diverse. So I see New World Order as being a multinational corporate control operating through the corporations to bring about economic control, financial control, and the political and the educational and the sociological aspects are subsidiary. This I find very dangerous because you're getting very, very close to the Nazi ideal, because fascism, after all, is an organization where business controls the government. As you see, as we talked about earlier, Hitler was financed essentially by businessmen. And businessmen in fact, have to have governments under their control. They don't like free enterprise, and here you've got to make a distinction between free enterprise and capitalism. I will support free enterprise. I believe in free enterprise, the individual making his own way through business. This is essential. It's the most efficient way to run an economic society. But capitalism is where a group or a corporation wants to monopolize, and it's the word monopoly that's essential here. They want a world monopoly, which is not free enterprise. That's capitalism almost in Leninist sense. It's world monopoly they want. That is the core of New World Order. The Skull and Bones today is one of a number of groups. It happens to be now a semi-secret group. If this is one secret organization, and I was fortunate enough to get the membership list, how do I know, or anybody know, there are not other secret groups where I have not, or nobody else has had the membership list? So we also have to take the hypothesis in mind that there could be other groups which are truly secret. Nobody here is aware of their existence, which have this ultimate purpose.